Hi everyone, my name is Leanne and today I'm going to be telling you about some of my classics collection. Now I have done quite a few videos around my Penguin English Library books, so I'm not going to be talking about those today. There will be a video upcoming about my Penguin English Library books that are showing you my entire updated collection of books. But today I'm going to go through some of the books that I don't have as vast of a collection of. So I'm going to be talking about my Penguin classics, my Penguin modern classics, my Oxford classics, my vintage classics, my Picador classics. Some of these I'm probably going to talk about in a bit more detail than others, but I just wanted to show you guys some of my collection. Let's start with my black Penguin classics. Now, one of these things is not like the other. This is my collection of the complete short fiction of Oscar Wilde. It is the only book I have in this particular edition. It has a very damaged spine. I studied this one at university, and this is, as it says, a collection of his shorter fiction, some of the fiction that was also aimed at children as well. I really like Oscar Wilde's writing. I'm always down for my Irish classics, of course, as well. In that same module at university, I studied What Maisie Knew by Henry James. This book is about the viewpoint of a little girl when her parents are going through a divorce. I don't think it's told from her viewpoint, but you just see a lot of observations from her perspective on the world as she is shuffled between these two parents. And that module that I did at university was all about experiences of children in the Victorian era. I really like Henry James' writing. I read The Turn of the Screw when I was at school and I hated it, but I remember really enjoying this book, and I recently read The Portrait of a Lady and I really liked that book as well. So I think I'm a Henry James stan. Next, I have two books that I haven't read yet. So I have A Vindication on the Rights of Women by Mary Wollstonecraft, and then I also have Mary and Maria by Mary Wollstonecraft, and then Matilda, which is by her daughter Mary Shelley. This is like a classic piece of feminist non-fiction, and this is a bind up of three shorter works, so Mary and Maria each being their own individual stories, and Matilda being a third individual story. Haven't read these yet, but would very much like to. Next, I have my Penguin modern classics. Again, one of these things is not like the others. So some of these modern classics have these white spines, and then some of them have this mint, is it mint, eggshell, greeny blue color? And I only have one of them in that minty color, and that is The Ice Palace, and this is a classic work of Norwegian fiction. I read this a couple of years ago in the lead up to Christmas because, ice, snow, Christmas. If I'm being completely honest, I don't remember that much about it. It's about two little girls and a fjord or a waterfall, and one of them goes missing. I'm not gonna bullshit you guys, I really don't remember much about this book. Wide Sargasso Sea by Jean Rhys. I read this when I was at university, and it was a module that was about adaptation. So we studied Titus Andronicus, the Shakespeare play, but also a film adaptation of it. We studied The Bloody Chamber by Angela Carter, but also the film The Company of Wolves. And then we studied Jane Eyre, but also Wide Sargasso Sea. This book is set in Jamaica in the 1830s, and it gives voice to the mad woman in the attic that we know from Jane Eyre. And this book also taps into a lot of colonial themes as well. The Lonely Londoners by Sam Selvon. This was a book that really taught me a lot about the Windrush generation in the UK. It is about a group of new arrivals into the UK from the West Indies, and about their experiences adapting to a new culture, to a new country, but also the immense difficulties that they face. I remember thinking this book was absolutely fantastic. I have heard a few critiques of it recently because of its treatment of women, and that was not something that I picked up on my first read of it. So I would be really interested to revisit this novel now and see, now that that has been pointed out to me, whether it is something that I would pick up on now. A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf. This was another one that I read at university. It wasn't a set text or anything, but I did a lot of my university work on feminist theory. So the ideas that Virginia Woolf speaks about in this was something that underpinned a lot of the work I was doing. And essentially what Virginia Woolf is talking about in this is the lack of privilege that a lot of women have when it comes to writing. They don't have the resources in terms of time or literal space in order to write. They don't have a place of study, a desk where they can focus on their writing, and how that immediately is a disadvantage to women. A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man by James Joyce. Now, I'm never going to read Ulysses. Zero intentions. Never want to do it. How did I feel about A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man? It's fine. So this is about this guy named Stephen who's in Dublin, and he's growing up, and he's trying to find his identity through art. I do think it's very well written, and I think there's a lot of it that is really important to the context of Irish writing throughout history. But young man figuring this shit out isn't something that hugely appeals to me. I'm glad that I've read this. I'm glad that it's part of my collection. Now, you might think, Leanne, why do you still own this book if you're not that into it? What I really want from my collection of books is for my library to really be able to represent me as a reader, for someone to be able to take a look at my shelves and be able to paint quite an accurate picture of who I am. And I think Irish writing and Irish writing throughout history is such an important part of me as a reader that I want to keep this on my shelves. And it is like a really good book. I just don't get all of the fuss around Joyce. And finally, for my modern classics collection, I have All My Sons by Arthur Miller. This is an American play. I don't really read many plays, but whenever I do, I always really enjoy that reading experience. This is about a family and it is set in the Second World War, and it's a book about the complicated ethics around profiteering from war. When I read this, I think I was in like my 3rd year of uni, and 21 Pilots were like a really big deal. And I didn't know that this play was where 21 Pilots got their name from. So that was a really jarring moment when I read this book, because I was like, oh, 21 Pilots, that's from the thing. I am going to take you through my Penguin Little Black Classics and mini moderns. I'm not going to go through them in any great detail because we would be here forever, but I'm just going to whiz through them. So we have A Modest Proposal by Jonathan Swift, Femme Fatale by Guy de Maupassant. I tried, okay? The Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. I feel like you just gotta read the Communist Manifesto like once in your life. The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe. The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, a total classic of feminist literature. Lord Arthur Savile's Crimes by Oscar Wilde. A Pair of Silk Stockings by Kate Chopin. It Was Snowing Butterflies by Charles Darwin. The Fall of Icarus by Ovid. Come Close by Sappho. Essential queer reading in my opinion. The Suffragettes, which is just like a collection of little news clippings and photos about the suffragettes. Letters to a Young Poet by Rainer Maria Rilke. Daphnis and Chloe by Longus. And The Lifted Veil by my bae, George Eliot. This tiny little modern classic is The World of Sex by Henry Miller. Don't really remember anything that he said in this book, but I'm glad that I own it. And on to the mini moderns. Letter from Birmingham Jail by Martin Luther King. I think it's really important to read this. The Great Hunger by Patrick Kavanagh. The Black Ball by Ralph Ellison. Daydreams and Drunkenness of a Young Lady by Clarice Lispector. The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House by Audre Lorde. I think if you are someone who is interested in activism and learning more about racism in particular, I think it's really important to read this and underpin it to all of the learning that you're doing. New York City in 1979 by Kathy Acker. Notes on Camp by Susan Sontag. The Cracked Looking Glass by Catherine Ann Porter. And Dark Days by James Baldwin. Next I have 4 Oxford classics. So the one of these that I haven't read yet is Scenes of a Clerical Life by George Eliot. I think this is a collection of shorter works by George Eliot. George Eliot is one of my favourite classic writers of all time, so I am looking forward to eventually getting around to reading this. The Water Babies by Charles Kingsley. This is probably one of my most tabbed books that I own. I mentioned the Victorian Childhoods module that I did where I studied Oscar Wilde's short fiction and What Maisie Knew, and I also studied the Water Babies as part of that module and I wrote my essay on it, hence all of the tabs. I don't really remember too much about the actual plot of this book. It's about like a chimney sweep who like dies and becomes a water baby. I don't remember much about it other than that. The Playboy of the Western World and Other Plays by J.M. Singh. This is another book that I've kept hold of because I feel like it really taps into my interest in Irish writing, both modern day and throughout history. And J.M. Singh was a really prominent playwright in the Anglo-Irish literary revival. The Mark on the Wall and Other Short Fiction by Virginia Woolf. Another mention for Virginia Woolf in this video. And this is, of course, a collection of some of her shorter work. I have 4 of these red-spined vintage classics. Stoner by John Williams, which I read very recently. A pleasant surprise for me. I enjoyed it a lot more than I anticipated. Beloved by Toni Morrison is just an incredible book. It's about a woman who is haunted by the ghost of her baby, but it's a book that has so much to do with trauma and slavery. It's an absolutely magnificent novel and I would highly urge you to read it. William Shakespeare's sonnets. I'm not a massive sonnet person. I'm not a massive Shakespeare person, but I did study some of his sonnets at university. I think they are interesting in kind of like the history of poetry. And I also have a very chunky collection of the collected poems of W.B. Yeats. Again, this was something that I studied at university in my very first year, and I think Yeats is an incredible poet. I mean, the world doesn't need me to say that. Like, the world knows that Yeats is an incredible poet. But if you are interested in poetry and learning more about the craft of it, I would really recommend reading some Yeats. And also, if you want to know more about Irish history, then I would really recommend reading some Yeats. My Picador classics. So I think the Picador classics are definitely like modern classics. I mean, Okay, like in this bundle I do have Bridget Jones' Diary and Bridget Jones' The Edge of Reason. These are absolutely classics, okay? If you don't think Bridget Jones is classic literature, fight me. I don't feel like I need to tell anyone about Bridget Jones. If we think about how Bridget Jones did like the template for a woman on the cusp of her 30s figuring out her shit, and how many incredible works have grown from that. Literally, if you don't think Bridget Jones is a classic, then we aren't friends. Essays in Love by Alain de Botton. I think that's how you say his name. I don't really know. Am I gonna tell the story of why I read this book? I basically read this book with a boy, and that boy ended up being a dick. But when we were both reading this book, we were having all these conversations about love. It's about a man and a woman who meet on a flight from Paris to London, and it's the beginning of their love story, and we see how they're basically trying to like force the relationship to work. He's also like idealizing her a lot at the start of the relationship. It gets to a point where they're both kind of panicking about whether this is actually what they want for the rest of their lives, how to navigate a serious relationship at this young age of being in their 20s. It has a lot of like very philosophical stuff around relationships, and I think your response to reading this book is more important than the content of the book itself, and it's something that I'm definitely glad that I read, although it feels slightly tainted now. Ario by Fran Ross. I didn't understand this book. I didn't understand it. Like, I don't know what more to say beyond, sorry if the camera angle changed, but basically what has just happened is there's a pile of books that was like here. You're perched on my TBR cart. The books fell. It pushed the TBR cart. There was chaos. What was I talking about? Oh yeah, Ario. Didn't really understand this book, not gonna lie. And finally, for my Picador classics, I have Red Dust Road by Jackie Kay, and this is her memoir all about discovering the identities of her biological parents. Jackie Kay is mixed race, and she was adopted by white Scottish parents, and throughout this book we go alongside her discovering in her adulthood who her biological parents were. So her white Scottish birth mother and her black Nigerian father, and it's about how those people as individuals lived up to or didn't live up to her expectations, and where her relationships are with those people now. What is really remarkable, I think, about this memoir is that it reads like a novel. Like, Jackie Kay is such a talented writer that she makes her memoir seem like a novelization, and it's just incredibly well written. And finally, I have 2 books from the Macmillan Collector's Library. So I have Round About the Christmas Tree and A Miscellany of Festive Stories, edited by Becky Brown. Pretty much does what it says in the tin. It's a collection of Christmas stories. And I also have Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass by Lewis Carroll. I did a full video where I spoke about my Alice collection because it's a book that has a very firm place in my heart, and I have a lot of different editions on it. So if you want to see a video all about my different Alice books, I will leave that linked so you can check it out. So there we have it. That is my classics collection. I have taken a lot of books off a lot of shelves. Do you have a particular edition of classics that you like to collect? Is that something that really bothers you? I know I have quite a modest classics collection compared to a lot of people, but I thought I would just take this opportunity to show you my collection. I have mentioned way too many books for them to all be linked down below in the description, so unfortunately I'm not going to do that this time. But if you do want to purchase some books for yourself, I will leave my affiliate links in the description so I can get a little kickback if you want to buy something. That's all I'm going to talk about today. I hope you guys are doing well, and I will speak to you in my next video.